Hello everyone, welcome back to another True Potential Do More With Your Money podcast. It has been just over 3 months, 100 days nearly, since Labour came to power. So for the next 30 minutes, we're going to talk about how we think they're getting on, what have been the key announcements so far. There's been a lot to talk about, and we're going to do that with the people to my right-hand side. Daniel Harrison, Chief Executive here at True Potential in the middle, Mark Henderson, Senior Partner, and at the end of the table, Diane Patterson, who's Head of Delivery. Nice easy one to start with. I'm going to ask you marks out of 10 so far for Labour's first 100 days. I'll start at the end of the table with you, Di, and work back towards me. What would you give Labour for their first 100 days?
Do I have to support this with any facts, or can it be purely based on emotion?
Well, I hope we'll get into some of the facts and emotion over the next half an hour, but I'll just take a number for now.
2 to 3 out of 10. 1 being the lowest end of the scale for me.
Absolutely. 10 being they've had a cracking start, 0 being not great.
Yeah.
You choose anywhere in between. Okay. A 2 and any advance on 2 or 3, Mark?
4. I'll be in the middle. I'll go 3, Peter.
3, okay. Yeah. So between 2 and 4 so far. What in particular, tell me why. We'll get into some of the announcements individually and we'll go through that over the next half an hour. But in particular, just in terms of the big picture, why are we down in 2s and 3s? What is it that stands out for you in terms of how they've managed their first 100 days?
I think for me, Peter, I was thinking about this on the way in this morning. They were voted in with a super majority. Mm-hmm. But I think the main reason for the super majority was actually just fatigue with the Tories and fed up with the Tories. So, as we've talked about in this podcast before, and people who are far better versed than me in terms of political commentators have said, Labour almost came in by default. Mm-hmm. But with the super majority, they should be able to do something interesting. Mm-hmm. And instead, it's been 100 days of moaning. Yeah. It's been 100 days of threatening as well, like, oh, watch out for this. And it's been 100 days of them acting like typical politicians, walking around with £2,000 glasses on, getting his missus dressed up and all sorts of things. It's like, they're lucky to get a 3, frankly, Peter, because what a waste of 100 days so far.
Yeah, politicians obsess about this 100 days. I mean, it's totally obviously picked out of thin air, but they all of them, and for always have, is obsessed about do this by 100 days. So in a way, why we picked 100 days? Well, because they do. We've not come up with that. That's when they set themselves a bit of a measure of how we're doing. Just to pick up on what Daniel said there, Mark, if you look at the election results back in July, you know, a lot of, and I think it's accurate, a lot of commentators said the Labour majority was very, very wide, but not very deep when you look at it. When you look at actually the number of votes they got and the share of the vote, yes, they racked up and stacked up a lot of seats, but it didn't look like there was a big depth of, if you like, will to have a Labour government. There might be more antipathy, as Daniel says. So do you think because of that mile-wide, inch-deep kind of majority they had, maybe they were always destined to sort of, the honeymoon was never going to last long?
I don't think the honeymoon lasted long at all, Peter, and I think that we're waiting for the budget, which is going to be the real first signs of any policy coming through. You know, it's like Daniel said, it revert to being typical politicians. You know, this morning Harriet Harman said missteps and clunkiness are to be expected. I'll tell you what, we're not allowed that degree of latitude here in the jobs that we do. Yeah. If I get onto a new aeroplane, I don't want missteps and clunkiness. They've got to hit the ground running and they've got to get it right, and they simply haven't. And there's other things as well coming through. Angela Rayner said that Sue Gray has been demonised in the media. What happened to Dominic Cummings? Exactly the same thing.
Well, for Sue Gray as well, it serves her right because she plotted against the last bunch. Briefed against them and lost people their jobs and the roles. Got herself into that cushy position and then has been found out and rightly demonised for it. Actually, you can't brief against the Tory party, which is what Sue Gray did in all the Partygate side of things.
When she was a civil servant as well, meant to be neutral. At least now she's in a political sort of position.
So, if you do that dance, don't expect so...
I think, what we were saying before about it, I've got my glasses here that weren't £2,000, by the way, and I paid for those ones myself. They're mine. TP didn't.
Mine.
And this is where politicians lose the voters, Peter. They absolutely lose them because a politician, hasn't changed the spots. They might have changed colour from blue to red, but it's exactly the same behaviour that they got themselves into difficulty with. You know, when we're talking about claiming for Bass, plugs to go in the sink and the duck pond and all of that type of nonsense. Got to be very, very careful here. Otherwise, we're going to find out that politicians are actually...
And the other thing that, people talk about, we had 14 years of the Tories. That means that Labour had 14 years to plan for what was going to happen eventually. Well, and so you shouldn't be making these missteps because you've had long enough to plan what you would do with your first 100 days.
I think you park the missteps behind. If I go back to my reason of my score, it sounds like I'm having a bit of a moan, which I am. But I go back to the point I left in the middle of that, which is what have they really achieved over the 100 days? And I know you've got some bullets here to share it. But I think this came from them having a manifesto, which was probably as thick as that one sheet of paper. It was all like, we don't know about that. And their entire strategy for the last 1-2 years was keep your noses clean, don't say anything controversial, we'll get voted in by default. And I think what that's maybe done, when you see the lack of meaningful progress, and even where a budget's imminent, and they're still like, we don't quite know, because there was no real hints about the budget in the conference a week or two ago as well. I think it's a sign of a government who knew they were going to get in and just took that absolutely for granted, because they've had not just, they've had 14 years, Peter, but they've had at least a year with that current shadow cabinet at the time and real cabinet now to be razor sharp and ready for government. And it would appear they're not.
One of the criticisms they get, of course, they're getting at the minute is the double standards, because they very deliberately, and it worked very well, played the moral high ground, or went on the moral high ground for the last year or two. And as you say, they're now getting tripped up by some of the very things that they were giving big criticism for. So that is the problem with taking the moral high ground, is you stand to fall off it. Have they got a point though, Diane? Because they do talk about this 22 billion black hole having in their eyes a very poor inheritance, and therefore they haven't got the space to do the things that they would want to do. Do you have any sympathy with that? Do you think that's fair enough?
Every government that comes into power has history and legacy to deal with, and they announced that there's a £22 billion hole, and yet you've got all of the public sector increases that are 10 billion of that. And then you look at what they've done in terms of the winter fuel allowance. They're starving pensioners of something that they've now since become to rely on when energy prices are at their all-time high. And then you find out that what they've actually done is means tested against a benefit that not everybody's claiming. Everybody starts to claim that benefit, which then means that what they're actually going to save is no longer appropriate. It just doesn't make financial sense.
Well, let's get into it, because that's one of the first things in terms of the meaningful, specific announcements that we've had, and that came very early when Labour came into power, very, very early. And I found that was odd. I mean, why? I don't know why. That was never going to be well received, so why make a standalone announcement about that? And then it's run to now, up to 100 days. I don't quite get why they did that.
Is it a sign that Starmer, who probably ranked himself as a bit of a centralist, like left centralist, has had to do a deal with the far left side of Labour? And unfortunately what you hear at times is all of those rich pensioners don't need this money. And you've got some of this with VAT on school fees, etc. as well, where there's some spiteful little policy in there, and when you look in brackets, it's because that's for rich people. And predominantly, if you look at who's predominantly a conservative or these days reform voters, etc., tends to be pensioners as well. So there's an element of saying, well, forget that. As Diane rightly says, it actually harms some people who really rely on that. Now,
that's the weird thing about it, isn't it? Because it's set so low at the threshold where you'd no longer get it, that it doesn't just hurt those.
No, but they've said they're going to means test in the future. You're like, well, why didn't you just leave it this year and then means test it next year when you've got an entire year to run it? But again, the law of unintended consequences, as I think we've got the stat there, there was 29,500 claims for benefits before the announcement, 75,000 for the 8 weeks afterwards, so more than doubled. And this is, we talk about this in our industry as well, beware the law of unintended consequences as well, because sometimes we can say policy or thinking which comes out and it can solve an issue for a few months or for a year, but 1 year, 2 years, 5 years down the line, it can create real problems.
And I think they were saying if everyone did, because when they got into some hot water about it, they tried to say, there's this pension credit that people can claim, which will top up their income, if you like. But if everyone does claim that, then it'll cost more than which is your point. But Mark, I'm just interested in this. What they could have announced that measure as part of the budget that's coming up at the end of this month, and it would have been lost in amongst everything else. But I just don't understand why they made a standalone announcement on something that was never going to be. Nobody was benefiting from it. It was only a takeaway. And of course, it's caused them so many headaches, and still to this day, it's running on. So I just don't get why they did that. Any ideas?
Well, perhaps I had nothing else to say. You know, Dan said the manifesto was wafer thin. So, in order to remind everybody that there is a new government, they have to say something, and they came up with that, which is a huge misstep. You know, to quote Harriet Harman, that was a misstep on that one. And the other thing, Peter, is usually at this stage, before pre-budget, there's been a good few leaks come out in the press. It's been very quiet so far, which kind of indicates, if you were suspicious, to say they haven't quite finalised what they want to do yet, so therefore there's no policy to leak. Now, this morning there's a couple of little things starting to come out about pension tax relief might not get touched. At one stage, 10 days ago, that was going to go. But the reasons stated for it are that the Treasury have said that it'll hit hardest those mid-managers within the NHS and within education. And you think, there's so many other people in this country that you need to look after. Not just those in the NHS and those in education. Let's make this for everybody and not divide.
I want to ask you a question. I mean, it's a little bit controversial, but as a private enterprise, private sector, we're all employed in the private sector. We all pay our taxes, as do people in the public sector. But, and I agree this, not everyone, I think this is accurate. I don't think you really can disagree with this, but you can have a private sector without a public sector. You can't have a public sector without a private sector to generate the wealth, generate the taxes that fund the public sector. I know there's a cycle, a benefit that the private sector gets from the public sector through all that. I get all that. But do you ever, in all parties, forever, it's always focused on the public sector element of that, the doctors, the nurses, the fire brigade, the police, everything else, fine. But do you as people who set up a private business from scratch, you didn't inherit it, it didn't exist, it does now, it's a very successful business, do you ever feel that you're a bit forgotten?
In that we've never had a pound, or even lower, a penny.
Well, not even in terms of a handout, though, just in terms of a bit of respect. We need companies like True Potential, like you, that set up businesses, because without that, where does the tax come from to fund public services?
Absolutely right, Peter. In order to fund things, and they're essential services, let's make that clear. They are essential services that have to be funded to provide benefit for people right across the UK. Never mind how much money they've got on the bank or how much they earn. There's a basic level of care that's needed. That comes, and it's funded from growth. And if there isn't growth in the economy, there'll have to be cutbacks. So this is why we've got to have a government here that's going to promote growth in the private sector.
Well, let's get on to a couple of things that they have announced then in terms of specific measures, and we can talk about them. But one of the interesting things is this National Wealth Fund that they talked about in opposition, said they were going to do. They've announced it. I think, is it about 7.3 billion? It seems to have. How does, first of all, Mark, if you would, maybe just explain what a National Wealth Fund is, because there are other countries that have these sovereign wealth funds, and then you can talk about how 7.3 billion compares to some of the other ones around the world.
7.3 billion in terms of a sovereign wealth fund is not really worth talking about, Peter.
What would give us an example of what a
You've got the sovereign wealth funds, which have come predominantly through the oil revenues with the Middle East funds. You've got the Norwegian fund, which if you just take, and this is not a political point, if you take the way the Norwegians have dealt with the wealth generated from North Sea oil to the way the UK governments have squandered that wealth, it just pulls apart. So this new initiative, 7.3 billion, it's a lot of money, Peter, but comparatively, it's tiny.
Would we be talking tens, hundreds of billions on some of these are there?
Absolutely.
Right, okay. Yeah. And then you think about high-speed rail is cost, I don't know, we're into like, what is it, 40 billion, 50 billion? It's way more than just that one fund.
It goes back to the public sector side of things, though, Peter, which is such an ineffective, inefficient structure, full stop. 7.3 billion would be wasted on a bunch of consultants in suits. But before you even lay a brick, there'll be a feasibility study about it, there'll be a middle manager brought in, etc., etc. And it's a British problem. It's not a Labour problem, so I'm not criticising. It's a British problem where I think we just have far too much bureaucracy, governance, and layers of people at the trough instead of people doing the work.
Don't forget the investigation will have to be after the event, though, when they realise that it was everybody's pals that got the roles and that money is being handed out left, right and centre without any validation of what they're actually going to do with it. So the billions that will cost to then investigate, because there'll be a public outcry and we'll be right back to where we were.
Do you agree with the idea of it, though? The concept of having a national wealth fund that we can invest in?
No.
I mean, I don't know. Presumably we've been investing in infrastructure all the way through and we haven't had one, so I'm not quite sure why we need one. But
I think, Peter, provide £7.3 billion of savings to private business to help them grow, which will then increase your tax revenue. And then you can just use the tax revenue to actually do what government are meant to do and run proper infrastructure projects and actually get this country running properly. You know, went to a party, for a friend's party last night, and it was only an hour and a bit's drive away. And where we live right now, it's just shocking. It's relentless in terms of roadworks. And this is on the A1, which is our major road in the UK. And you can't get easily even from London to Newcastle in a car without sitting in 2, maybe 3 different road projects. And guess what? There's nobody working on them as well. And it is, you know, it's a disgrace, actually, when you look at it, because you think, what a raggy, run-down-looking place we have at times. So 7.3 billion wouldn't scratch it.
Make the argument there, because I can't understand this, having never constructed a business like this that you have. I mean, but what would, if they were to say, right, let's do what Daniel says. Let's say Rachel Reeves is watching this podcast and thinks, well, that sounds like an interesting idea. Let's use that money to reduce the tax burden or whatever burden on private businesses. What would you do with the freed up capital that you then have? Give us an example of what that could go towards and how that would generate growth.
Where, like here?
Yeah.
You pay tax, you pay your staff more, you could hire more staff. You could do what we're looking to do right now, which is expand the headquarters, which then you're using local builders, you're using local suppliers, etc., which further boosts the rest of the economy. All of that's a huge saving, Peter, and all that's a huge help. And the other side where government could really help as well is in trying to unpick some of the red tape, you know, which I was mentioning before in terms of the bureaucracy and the governance, which happens across all industries, I feel, in the UK. So this is not a financial services problem. This is, if I speak to my peers and colleagues who run other firms out there, they say exactly what I'm saying, which is we're doing more than ever in terms of paperwork and in terms of tick boxing. And what that means is you're spending more time being tidy and less time thinking about growth.
I think, Peter, the trick that the UK have missed is to create a true digital economy. If you look at the way broadband has been rolled out across the country, it's patchy. There's other European countries who have got far, far superior broadband. If we had we could do so much more with an investment. You could also look at what's happening when it comes to trading with Europe. You know, if that was truly digitalized, you wouldn't have the problems that we're experiencing at the moment. So using that money constructively would be great, but the big fear is it just gets wasted, as Dan said. It gets tied up, it gets locked up, and it's all bureaucratic spending, nothing to help businesses grow.
Well, and that leads us in nicely to another announcement, which is the Great British Energy. Now, I think most people, when they hear that, and Di, you mentioned this point earlier at the start around people's energy bills being massive. I think when people hear there's going to be Great British Energy, this organisation, you think, oh, well, so will I then be able to choose between gas provider A, gas provider B, and I'll have GB Energy on my list of providers. But it's not that, is it? It's not a company that's going to, you can't buy energy. It's purely to invest in, to fund other sorts of investment into clean energy. So is that does this strike you as a gimmick, or perhaps answering a critical question about how we produce more energy at home and become less reliant on importing gas and such like? Anyone want to go first on that one?
I think we do need to be more self-sufficient.
Yeah.
I think the geopolitical stance at the minute is so unstable that you couldn't but help look at and think, well, what if something did truly happen? What position would we be in? But do I think this is the right time for it? Absolutely not. I think there would be so many other things that they could do that aren't just words about clean energy. To me, they just want to be famous for doing something that's not substantial.
It's just called the Great British Quango.
Yeah.
Just, just
Yeah.
It feels like it's going to be
cut
another
to the
Quango.
chase, you
Yeah.
know, and they're even headquartered up in Aberdeen. Now, I've got nothing against Aberdeen at all, but before someone drives down there from Scotland and gets me. And I understand, obviously, that's where a lot of our kind of industry is in terms of the oil and gas. In any case, but what's that going to mean? It's a very expensive part of the world up there because of the industry which it attracts. And if we're going to have yet another agency, it's going to be incredibly expensive to set it up there. It's going to be incredibly expensive then to hire a new set of civil servants to work up there, etc. Why not look to redevelop a different part of the country so Aberdeen doesn't become more and more important in terms of being all of the energy there as well? And this should be the way to think, is, look more joined up. And the idea, I think it's Diane rightly says, of course it's a good want to be more self-sufficient in terms of our energy. It's good to think wider than that, but do we need yet another agency to go into a place where it's oil and gas heavy already? Because guess what might happen? We just rely more on oil and gas up there, and we don't think outside the box.
Mark, do you think is it what we need, or is it too soon to tell, or is it a gimmick, or where do you stand?
I think it's a long-term thing, Peter. Acknowledge that you've got to start somewhere, and I think if just anybody who drives around the UK sees the wind farms which are there, there's solar farms popping up. My thoughts, Peter, are that the oil industry and the big multinationals will come up with a better form of cheaper energy in a cleaner way, because they've got a real vested interest in it, and it comes down to, we've said many times, skin in the game. And if you create again this bureaucracy of administrators and agencies who could go on to their next job within a short period of time, as opposed to companies, big companies that have got a vested interest in getting it right, I think that's the way to sort it out.
I mean, the other point of this, of course, is that this is all about reducing our own carbon emissions as a country. I think estimates will vary, but I think we're responsible for maybe 1% of the carbon emissions. And we can do all this with GB Energy and wind farms and everything else. But isn't China building a new coal-fired power station every week or something?
Take yourself to China, to India, or the United States. I holiday or vacation regularly in the United States, and us closing the window or driving around an electric Tesla here does not even scratch the amount of damage an American does, in terms of driving a 6.9 litre truck, aircon blasting out of everywhere, etc., etc. There's such huge users of energy and all of that there's no point being a neat and tidy little island in the middle of, which is like at the cost of growth and at the, and even, I mentioned before, some of the language which is coming out right now treats me as spiteful. And you even read this like loopholes with energy firms, and, we're going to put the profit levy up further, etc. You just do what Mark says and allow the private businesses who, if oil and gas does run out, they do need alternatives. And, Mark, I'll not put you on the spot with the exact statistic, but, you and the team always used to talk about how much a Shell or a BP were actually investing in renewable energies. But if you talk about putting an energy profits levy up from 35% to 38%, that's 3% less money, which can then be spent on renewable research.
No, I think that's, it's accepted that the oil reserves are finite, which means that the oil companies and the oil producing states have got to get the most they can out of that. And I don't mean in terms of money, I mean in terms of how long those supplies are going to last, and the energy burn will become much, much more efficient, which will help the whole environment.
Yeah.
It's just popular though, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like at
I'm
the
not
minute,
even sure
everybody.
it's popular, Diane.
No, I just mean in terms of
yeah.
the people wanting it. So you've got your protesters left, right, and centre talking about what they want, what they need, and how it has to happen. Something like this becomes popular with groups like that, and all of a sudden the government can be sanctimonious and look what we've done, and this is how we've done it. When in reality, they haven't really done anything.
To play devil's advocate though, just because we are a small contributor to the overall carbon emissions, but does that mean we shouldn't do our bit? I guess the challenge is how do you get the others to do their bit as well? Because on our own we can make very little impact, apart from making ourselves cold and everything else. But what is the answer? I mean, how do you get America, China, other countries like that, or India, to play their part? I don't know.
You don't, because the world isn't a democracy. It's each country has their own rights, their own beliefs, and their own way of doing things. And of course, you can collaborate, but this isn't new. You go back 20 years with Al Gore, etc. Trying to get everybody together in terms of climate. May even be longer than that. And have we seen any progress? Possibly not, Peter. But I think the majority side of things, and before anybody criticises, of course you don't want to create climate damage, etc. Of course you don't want to create any sort of harm at all. But I think there's a jaded view from the silent majority right now. So as Di rightly says, you get protesters shouting up and down. But I think there's a lot of people out there who are just like, can we not just get on with things instead of just all of these kind of new pet projects and this is going to be a great new initiative, etc. Most people, I think, want an easy life and they want to feel better off. Then they want to enjoy themselves. As we've spoken about here, there's nothing enjoyable here.
Well, let's try with the final one, see if we can get some enjoyment. It's the budget in 3 weeks' time. If that's my best hope, I've got no chance.
Everybody's just switched off.
Thanks for tuning in.
What do they have to do? I mean, what from your point of view, what does it's the point? Pointless talking about what they might do because no one knows. And as you've said, Mark, last week there was. It was going to be this. That looks like it's out now. It's going to be this. Who knows? But what do you think the Labour government needs to do in the budget?
They need to have a confident chancellor, and they need to show fairness. And they talk about fairness, and it's always downstream. It has to be 100% fair to every individual in the UK, Peter. And this is, for me, it's the first main announcement that will be made. All of this noise is just political stupidity. The budget itself is the first chance that they've got to show the country that they are capable of government.
What do they need to do?
I think they need to stop being afraid of what everybody else is going to say in terms of, oh, you can't say that because you might hurt somebody's feelings. You shouldn't do that because, God forbid, that you do something that, again, will upset people. Yes, we're talking about this in terms of the reality of what we know, but it's I feel like they're fearful of saying something that will be classed as not woke, because woke now seems to be this thing that everybody wants to be, and I think they need to stop trying to be famous. I think they need to be politicians as opposed to being people on Twitter and people on all of the social media sites. I'm not saying that they don't need them to manage their campaigns, but I think they need to be a politician. We didn't know any of this 20, 30 years ago. We had no idea what was actually going to happen because there wasn't the media surrounding it, and whether somebody decorated somebody's flat or somebody had been given tickets to a game. We had absolutely and what somebody's salary was. We had no idea because when I was growing up, politicians seemed to be, and I could be completely wrong because I only know what I grew up believing, but politicians seemed to, they actually tried to do something worthwhile instead of the fluff around the edges, which is all we've had now for any amount of years. Yeah.
Would you like to see them leave pensions well alone? Because this is always the thing that's tempting.
I think they really do. I think they've caused some damage over the last couple of months with Rachel Reeves and the gang floundering, second guessing, trying to almost pull in the press about it. Why do I mean they caused damage? I've got the facts. Our clients have been on the phone for weeks now asking us for our thoughts. Should I take more tax-free cash out now before it gets snaffled up? Now, that's not because we've briefed our clients about that at all. That is solely down to the government leaking and trying to discuss policy on the hop in the press. And it's not a way to act, actually. I'll go back to Diane's point. Politicians are meant to be serious, dull, people who are serving, and I mean dull in a good way, who give policy and direction to the people who've trusted them and voted them in.
Yeah.
Not briefing newspapers off the record and getting them to leak stories about tax-free cash, etc. That's a sign of a weak government. That's a sign of a government who don't know what they want to do yet. And if you ever mess around with people's money, and if you definitely mess around with people's pensions, it's going to create so much questions and so much fear. And we don't need to do that. You know, the UK public aren't fools. You know, and especially people with good pensions, because they were sensible enough 20, 30, 40 years ago to save some money for a long-term retirement from there. So leave well alone. And what would I like them to say, Peter? Probably the antithesis of what I'm saying earlier. Make the most of your majority. Be straightforward and just say, in this budget, we think this, so we are doing that. We think this, so we are doing that. And this goes back to don't treat people as fools. Tell them, we think this, so we're going to combat it. As opposed to just everything's up there. And even, you know, like saying, you know, we'll not increase taxes for working people, is what they said before the election. What the hell does that mean? I'm a working person, but is it maybe because I earn a bit more than someone in the street? Does that make them a working person and I'm a who knows what? It's this vague-ish language which creates problems. It creates questions, and questions then can create fear, and fear can make people make wrong decisions.
And then let's finish up with what would we say to our clients, and who, you know, whether we're doing our bit to just go, look, you know, calm down, and to the government that is, and just, you know, don't make decisions that might have those unintended consequences that Daniel talked about. But what would our message be to clients then, Mark? Would it be, you know, whatever they announce in the budget? Of course, we don't know, but normally these things come in the new tax year in April. So we don't know what's going to happen after that, but we do know what allowances we've got today. What would we say to clients?
We would expect any changes to come at the end of the tax year, beginning of the new tax year in April. But George Osborne did put a spanner in the works. He threw a change mid-tax year. You know, so that this is not like a Labour bashing session here. He did that. I think that for those with a pension, particularly Peter, where the majority of our clients sit, if you take that tax-free lump sum now, panicking, thinking it's going to be taken away, you are taking money out of your pension, and the purpose of the pension is to give you an income during retirement. If you take that away, it's gone. So think very, very carefully about that. Leave the money in the tax-free wrapper that the pension represents. That's what I would say to people at the moment. We'll have to wait and see what comes out at the end of the month. But for pensions, you've got leave well alone, or actually do something and simplify them further to make it everybody understand just what they can and can't do in a pension. So I think that the narrative has to be right, Peter, and the new government are at the moment looking fairly indecisive, and they've got to come away from that very quickly, or they'll lose what credibility they have left.
And they've got minimum 5 years. I mean, it could be a lot longer with the majority they've got, but minimum 5 years. You don't win the next election in the first 100 days, but you can almost lose it by getting.
And that's
getting
why I've seen about being bold, Peter. You know, actually let us as the UK public know what this government is going to stand for. Get a good budget out. Use your majority to make sure it's not just voted but supported fully, and then spend the next 4 to 5 years making it work. So actually, people say Keir Starmer's government stood for this and they achieved that, and that would be great. And again, as Mark says, it's not a Labour bashing session. It bashed the Conservatives plenty on here over the last few years, as well, because it was very unclear in the end what that government actually represented, what it actually positively outputted as a government. And look, I'm a big patriot. I love my country. I want the country to do well, and that comes from good government, comes from good leadership.
Good. Okay. Well, nice point to finish on. Thank you very much, Diane, Mark, And Daniel, you heard it there, that the verdict of our panel on this podcast is an average of around about 3 out of 10 so far for the first 100 days. Who knows where we'll be in another 100? Maybe they'll have improved. We'll come back in 100 days and tell you what we think then. But for now, I hope you would rate this podcast more than 3 out of 10. And if you would, don't forget to give us a like and a thumbs up, and share the word as well, because as you've just seen in the last 35 minutes or so, we do like to just tell you it as we see it, and we don't do what others do and sugarcoat it. We just tell you it honestly and fairly, we hope, as well. Okay, thank you very much for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.
This video is not a recommendation or personal financial advice. With investing, your capital is at risk. Investments can fluctuate in value, and you may get back less than you invest.